And if any of you are fire wardens, would you leave the room, please? Now, I'm sorry that we didn't get a bigger venue. I'm not at all surprised, given the speaker today and the nature of the series. I want to start off. I'm Chuck Geisler from Development Sociology. It's lovely to see so many of you here and so many students in particular. And what's very different about this audience is that you do represent very different departments, or so we think, and that was the intent of this series. We are copying the example that started in, I believe, ecology and systematics a year ago, and was an intent to spread biology, have a big biology program, and do a joint seminar series which has gotten off to a great start, and there's no reason not to try to do the same thing in the social sciences on issues of mutual interest. So the Department of Natural Resources, largely thanks to the energies of Stephen Wolf in DNR, Catherine McComas, Greg Poe, and myself got together over the summer and started pooling names of people that we thought would be of general interest in a new cross-departmental series called Environment and the Social Sciences. There will be two speakers this semester, Bob Frank speaking today, and Sir Dasgupta, who will be speaking in the October 5th. And you should note that Dasgupta's talk will be at 12, more or less middle of the day, and it'll be in Plant Science G10. Let me just check the actual time on that so we get it right. It's 12:30 on October 5th. The point is that these seminars are a little bit irregular, and the reason is obvious. Because they're being sponsored by different departments, most of us have slightly different seminar times, so that's going to determine when we get together. So please stay tuned. There will be two more wonderful seminars in this series in the spring, and we will get you advance notice on those through your respective departments. There could hardly be a better, there's two chairs here, one here that I see for anyone who prefers not to stand. There could hardly be a better speaker to kick off this series than Bob Frank from the Johnson Management School, somebody who for a long time has done exactly what the spirit of this seminar series is about, and that is casting his gaze outside of economics and management and behavioral economics into obviously psychology, but also sociology, biology, and I guess a generic area that might be called public policy. Bob has a very, very interesting publication record. The book that he'll be talking about today, The Darwin Economy, is his most recent. It's the last of 10 books which he has published, and many of these are cross-disciplinary and very large in their visions, going way back to the time that he was a junior professor. A number of them deal with the middle class in crisis, with luxury consumption. And one of the books on the list, should you care to look, is called The Distributive Consequences of Overseas Foreign Investment, co-authored with somebody called Ben S. Bernanke. So obviously Bob has had his oars in important quarters, both public service. His publications appear not only in academic journals, but in many public fora that influence policymakers and public decision-making, which is one of the reasons we were so excited about bringing him here today. This list of publications goes on and on and on. You can imagine all of the publications he has in professional journals, and I'm actually going to restrain myself rather than going through all of those. And the reason is, not too many years ago, I went to a well-attended lecture at the law school celebrating the presence of an international lawyer, and the person who introduced him went on and on and on about his publications for about 10 minutes. And the speaker was evidently becoming more and more uncomfortable, kind of looking at his watch, am I going to get my talk in? And finally, the person hosting and introducing sat down, and the speaker came up, and he looked out at the audience and he said, "Did you bring me here to speak or to breed?" And, Bob, I want you to know we brought you here to speak. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to speak, and I'm honored by the brisk turnout. Thank you all for giving up time out of your day. It's never free to go to a talk. As I said in the blurb, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's our favorite saying as economists, and in general that's right. But I think when we're really messing up very badly, the spirit of that remark doesn't really hold. It is possible, when you're failing to exploit readily seizable opportunities, to have more of one thing without giving up anything else of value. And that's going to be my theme. I'm not going to talk so much directly about the book, although many of these issues do come up in the book. I thought I would try to focus my remarks on issues that will be in sharp relief during the presidential campaign launched with the conventions. The big job, the overarching first task has to be to end the persistent demand shortfall recession that we've been struggling through since late 2008. This is a very simple problem. It's one we know how to solve. Political gridlock has prevented us from solving it, and it turns out that the cost of solving it would not be very great, and there would be enormous benefits from solving it. What is a demand shortfall recession? That's when people aren't spending enough, or agents in the economy aren't spending enough in total to generate enough demand for everybody who wants to work to be put to work. Keynes is the go-to source on demand shortfall situations. The general theory of everything, written in 1936, described why in such situations they occur, particularly in the wake of financial crises. Excess supply tends to be persistent. It doesn't cure itself, certainly not in the short run. In the wake of a financial crisis, consumers are burdened with debt. There's a high unemployment rate still 4 years later. They're afraid they'll lose their jobs if they haven't already, so they're not spending very much. Businesses, for their part, are holding back on investment spending, although it's picked up some since 2009. Why aren't they investing? It's not because there aren't useful new ideas out there to invest in. It's because they already have enough capacity to produce more than people want to buy. Why build a bigger factory if your existing factory is big enough to do what needs to be done for now? Wait and build your bigger factory later, earn interest on the money, or buy Apple stock and watch the value grow in the meantime until you need the extra capacity. So if you'll remember from your macroeconomics course, those of you who took one, this distant equation, y equals c plus I plus g, that's the national income identity. Y is national income, that's the sum of consumption, that's going nowhere. Investment, that's going nowhere. What's the other component? G, that's government spending. And so Keynes's recommendation was, when the ship is stalled in the water, you need a massive increase in government spending to get it going again. That will then generate momentum on its own as the flow of income spreads throughout the community. One person's income receipt is spent for other things. Other people receive the income from that spending, and it starts to circulate. Well, that's the theory. Why aren't we doing that? Well, we did a little bit of that. Some say we tried it and it failed. We had a $787 billion stimulus package passed in President Obama's first year in office. It was not the stimulus package I would have prescribed. It had a lot of useless junk larded into it. That's what happens when you have a democratically crafted bill that goes through the House and the Senate. You get a lot of junk larded in, but it was not totally a useless bill, and all the studies of the bill suggest that it really did help prevent the decline in output and employment from being more severe than it was. During the first 4 months of the financial crisis, output and employment were falling more rapidly than at any time during the Great Depression. We were really falling into the abyss in a terribly frightening way. The stimulus package helped, but it was $787 billion spread over 3 years, and the demand shortfall that it was trying to cope with was $2 trillion a year. That was and so it just wasn't big enough. People were warning at the time it wasn't big enough. Could President Obama have gotten a bigger package through the Congress? I don't think so. I think he should have pushed for a bigger package so that when this one proved inadequate, he could at least point to the record and show, I warned you that this wouldn't be enough, but that's not in his DNA to proceed in that way, evidently. But the stimulus package was the right move. It was just too small. So where does that leave us? Well, we should do more stimulus. That's probably not going to happen if you look at the way the votes line up in Congress. Why isn't it going to happen? Because people say we can't afford to borrow more money. Look at the federal debt. It's now up to $16 trillion, bigger than the GDP, which it has been at other times in the past without sinking the country. How can we possibly borrow even more money as a pretense for getting the economy out of the rut? The rut is the $16 trillion deficit, according to these people. Well, that's wrong-headed. The deficit exists because we didn't pay our bills leading up to the financial crisis. It's been made worse by the financial crisis because during the financial crisis, tax receipts have fallen precipitously and expenditures for the social safety net have risen precipitously. That, of course, makes the deficit go up. But the idea of putting the economy back to work trumps all of those concerns. Right now, there are things we need to do. I'm not going to say anything controversial today. I realize there are many things I could say that might ruffle some feathers, but I decided I would try to persuade as many fence sitters as might show up in an audience like this, that there really are clear steps we can take and should take that would not require anybody to believe anything unreasonable. So here's one pitch. We have a woefully dilapidated infrastructure system in the United States. The bridges are crumbling. The roads have foot-deep potholes in them. The schools have leaky roofs. The sewage systems are failing. Water systems aren't up to snuff. That needs to be refurbished. Nobody denies that it needs to be refurbished. When should we refurbish it? Should we refurbish it now, or should we wait and refurbish it when the economy is back on its feet? The people who counsel short-run austerity seem to think the second path would be better. That's an unreasonable position. There's no way to slice that position that makes it sound reasonable. Let me give you one simple example. There's a stretch of Interstate 80 in Nevada, a 10-mile stretch. This is on the Department of Transportation website for the state of Nevada. They can bring that stretch of road back up to standard if they repair it today for $6 million. If they let it wait 2 years, it's a very heavily truck traffic route. The frost will heave the cracks in the roadbed up and out a lot more. You'll need to spend 5 times that amount if you wait 2 years, $30 million to fix that same stretch. Does anybody seriously propose to let Route 80 go back to gravel? That's not one of the options I've heard discussed anywhere in the political debate. We're going to fix Route 80. The question is, do we fix it now or do we fix it later? If we fix it now, there are people out of work who know how to fix it. There are machines sitting idle in the yard that you would need to do those jobs. Materials, because the whole world is in a downturn, are cheaper now than they'll be in a few years' time. What about the money to finance the projects? The international capital community is begging us to take their money at essentially negative interest rates in real terms, interest rates lower than even the meager expected rate of inflation for the next couple of years. If you had a leaky roof that you needed to fix, and you could fix it cheaply now or fix it in 2 years for more money, when would you fix it? That wouldn't be a hard decision. What if you were a family trying to decide whether to put insulation in your attic? Energy prices went up. You're already in debt. What if the austerity advocate could say, well, you're in debt, you can't afford to put insulation in your attic, that would impoverish your grandchildren. Would it? The calculation needs to be done. If the insulation in your attic would reduce your utility bill by $100 a month, and the monthly payment on the bill, the loan you need to take out to do the job would be $50 a month, then not doing the job would impoverish your grandchildren. There's no reckoning by which the family's worse off by not doing the job right away. It's the exact same argument about fixing Interstate 80 right now. And then name any one of 10,000 projects. The American Society for Civil Engineers put out a report card for American infrastructure. And the average grade across all the sectors they took surveys of was a D. And they identified some $2 trillion worth of infrastructure projects that desperately needed to be done. Most of them are in the same category with the I-80 example. Do them now, cheap, put unemployed people back to work, wait 2 years, spend a lot more, and have to bid skilled workers away from other useful jobs to do the same tasks. It's just a no-brainer. Why didn't we do it? President Obama last night didn't mention his jobs bill, but his jobs bill contained a very big chunk of infrastructure spending. It would not even come to the floor for a vote because of obstructionist opposition in the Congress. Is it controversial to say that 2 years ago, Mitch McConnell said that their first objective was not to see the country move forward, but to see that President Obama didn't get a second term? That's the most controversial thing I'll say. It's true, you can go to the record and see that he said that. Is there a link between the votes in Congress and that sentiment? I don't know. It's not a wild conjecture to imagine that there could be such a link. So, all right, first job, get the economy back on its feet. Does that require major sacrifices? No. It doesn't require that we give anything up at all. We're now operating well below full employment. By doing these jobs, we would not only be getting bridges and roads that we value that we wouldn't have otherwise, we'd be putting people back to work who'd be spending money. Others would be receiving money and spending it. They'd be paying taxes. Both of my two youngest sons entered the worst labor market in 2 generations. That's going to be a penalty to them for the rest of their lives. That's true for every young person in the last 4 years. They're not going to earn as much. Their careers will start off more slowly. They'll progress through the ranks less rapidly because of that. The capital stock of the nation, because businesses haven't been investing, will be forever smaller. That means productivity will be forever smaller. That means wages will be forever lower. That in turn means tax receipts will be forever lower. There's no sacrifice to do the right step here. It's win-win. There should not be a debate about this. This is utter stupidity that we're not doing this. And again, I said I wouldn't say anything controversial. I don't believe you can say that's controversial unless you have some way of framing the argument that makes my calculation of the costs and benefits of taking that step seem misleading. I don't believe that it is misleading. What about the debt problem in the long run? I part company with many of my colleagues on this one. I think it's a really serious problem. Why should we keep borrowing money to spend on things rather than saving out of our own incomes to buy those things ourselves? If we borrow more and more money, especially if we borrow it from abroad, which is something we didn't used to do but have been doing, then sooner or later the debt gets so big that when interest rates go back to normal levels, the amount you're paying out is a big chunk of your national income. That's going to other people. It's not available for us to spend on things we value here at home. That's stupid. There's also the miracle of compound interest. If you borrow money to buy the things you want, then you're paying somebody else interest. If you save to buy the things you want, well, you don't get them right away, but you accumulate in the account in which you save, and you accumulate so quickly that the amount you can spend each year, if you consume, let's say, 80% of your income, that means saving 20% of your income. If you consume 80% of your income, that means that after a few years' time, 80% of the much bigger income you'll have, counting the interest on the money you save, will be bigger than the 99% of income you're now consuming, because you don't have any savings and it's not building up and it's not generating any interest that you can consume out. So if you want to consume, if that's your only goal, you want to consume as much as you can during your lifetime, everybody ought to be saving 30% of his income. That's how you consume. It's stupid not to consume. If that's what you want to, it's not to save. If you want to consume, if that's your goal, you should be saving at a very high rate. We weren't saving. That was one of the things that spawned the financial crisis. We were so in debt that that enabled the crisis to occur precipitously with full effect. So we got to pay down the debt. How can we pay down the debt? Well, some say we can do it quite easily by eliminating wasteful government spending. Well, what do you propose to eliminate? You have to name the programs you want to eliminate. Why do programs exist in the first place? They exist because constituents want them. So you want to take aim at a government program, tell me which one it is. When we look and see which programs get cut, when governments do cut because they have to cut, look which ones they are. They're not the ones, they're not the bridges to nowhere that get cut. It's the projects that have the least forceful voices advocating for them. So what did the Bush administration cut when it was forced to cut because of the deficits that the tax cuts for the high-income earners during the first years of the Bush administration ran up the deficit so rapidly? They were looking for things to cut. They cut the Energy Department's program to round up poorly guarded nuclear materials in the former Soviet Union. These are materials that the terrorists want. They're in poorly fortified facilities, attended to by soldiers who drink too much, who don't get paid regularly. We ought to be locking those things down as quickly as possible. We cut the budget for that program. My two youngest sons live in New York. That's where those things are going to end up if we let them out. That wasn't a good program to cut. We cut the National Science Foundation's research budget. That's the lifeblood of our future productivity increases. What are we doing cutting that? Nobody knows about the National Science Foundation research budget. That's why they could cut it. They're looking for things to cut. What can we cut? We can cut the things that won't get me thrown out of office. That's what we can cut. So yeah, look for waste in government. Cut waste in government. I'm a big advocate of lean government, efficient government. The people who did the best job of that, interestingly enough, were Clinton and Gore. They went through and Clinton put Gore in charge of finding waste in government. They actually did weed out a lot of waste to good effect. That's a useful enterprise. Taxpayers get resentful when they see people gold bricking on the public payroll. You can't provide good services if you're not willing to take hard choices with how you manage the services you do provide. So yes, by all means, cut out the waste. But look, we've got tens of millions of people retiring in the next 20 years. Does anybody who's familiar with the numbers think it would be remotely possible to balance the budget by cutting wasteful government spending? That's a pipe dream. That's a total pipe dream. Nobody could stand up in front of an informed audience and make a claim like that. That's not to say nobody will stand up in front of an informed audience and make a claim like that, but I think there's starting to be some rumblings out there. People are starting to look more critically at the claims that are being made. That's a preposterous claim. You can't do it on the strength of cutting wasteful government spending. Just not to be in the cards. So we're going to need more revenue, and here's where I think the exciting possibilities come. In the book that Chuck mentioned, I talk about a prediction, a fearless prediction I make in the opening of the book, which is that in 100 years' time, if we ask economists who was the founder of their discipline, they won't say Adam Smith. which is what 99% of them would say if you ask the question today. They'll say instead Charles Darwin, the great British naturalist. Why will they say that? I think that he will eventually be recognized as the person who really understood at a deeper level the relationship between competition on the one hand and overall welfare on the other. Smith's disciples cite his invisible hand model. They're way more uncritically enthusiastic about it than Smith ever was. They say just turn selfish people loose in the marketplace and you'll get the best possible results in all cases. Smith didn't believe that. Smith, if you read him carefully, sounded like a whiny liberal. He was worried about firms with market power are going to exploit workers and consumers. We need this and that protection. I think in Smith's day that was probably a more well-grounded concern than in the modern era. In the modern era, we need to worry more about powerful firms buying favors from the government. That's the big danger. We don't need to worry so much about powerful firms fooling their customers. We're living in the information age. If somebody's trying to sell you a crappy product for too much money, rival producers can figure out where you are and get information to you. Microsoft can't make me buy their stuff anymore. The market's way more competitive than it would ever be. So I'm willing to accept the free marketeer's assumption that markets are perfectly competitive. Of course, they're not perfectly competitive, but pretty close. People are rational. I'll accept that assumption too, even though behavioral economists have been making their living for 30 years showing that people are not so rational. Amos Tversky, one of the founders of behavioral economics, used to like to say of his Stanford colleagues in the psychology departments, and my colleagues, they study artificial intelligence. Me, I study natural stupidity. He would take great delight in putting people in situations where they had all the information necessary to get the right answer to a really simple question, and they would screw it up. So yeah, people do make mistakes, but I think, when we make decisions about the important things that we have a lot of information about and experience with and friends to talk to and advisors to consult, we don't do that badly. We have goals, we try to fulfill them as best we can. If there were some really big opportunities where we were missing, word would leak out. So I'm going to give the free marketeers everything they want. People are rational, markets are competitive. I'm going to add one more assumption, and I don't think anybody in the room could quarrel with it, and this is the Darwinian central insight, which is that important aspects of life are graded on the curve. It's not how big you are, it's not how strong you are, how smart you are, it's whether you're bigger or stronger or smarter than those you're competing directly against. That's what determines whether your stuff gets into the next generation. And when reward depends on relative payoffs, all bets about the invisible hand are off. In those cases, you get incredibly wasteful arms races much of the time. Not in every instance, but much of the time. The cover illustration on the book shows two bull elk locked in battle with their antlers intertwined. The modern bulls have antlers that are 4 feet across. They weigh 40 pounds. They're huge. They're an enormous handicap when the animals are chased into wooded areas by wolves. They can't maneuver. They're easily surrounded and killed. Why are their antlers so big? Darwin had an explanation. It was that bull elk, like the males in most vertebrate species, are polygynous. That means they take more than one mate if they can. If they can qualifier is important. That means if some succeed at that, others don't get any mates at all. And that's the ultimate loser slot in the Darwinian scheme of things. Not good to be in that slot. And so, of course, males take any step they can to increase the likelihood they'll pair off with a female. And in most species, many species, that means fighting with other males for access. And here, it just so happened that antlers were the weaponry that seemed to predict who'd win in those pairwise contests. And so mutation happens. Antlers used to be this big, then they got to be 30% bigger. The animal carrying that mutation won a lot of fights, left a lot of copies of the genes for the mutation in the next generation. other mutations accreted, and so we had this runaway arms race, literally a process that's exactly analogous to a military arms race. It doesn't go on without end. Some reviewer wrote, well, if this were really a problem, natural selection would have weeded out any bull with antlers that were too big. They don't grow to be 40 feet across. They don't grow to be 4,000 pounds. It stabilizes. You know, nations don't spend 200% of their GDP on bombs. They spend too much of their GDP on bombs. An animal with 40-foot antlers would never get his nose off the turf. He wouldn't compete effectively for mates. True. But here's the only point I make with this example, which is that every bull would have a good reason to push the red button if that's the one that would make all antlers shrink by half when everybody pushed it. The same fights would be decided in the same way as before, and every animal would be more mobile than before. They'd be less likely to be surrounded and killed by wolves in a thicket. Why wouldn't you push the red button if you could figure it out? That would be just a no-brainer to do that. Darwin wasn't much interested in steps like that because only humans, for all practical purposes, have the communication, cognitive skills to recognize the structure of these problems and be able to take actions like that. But we do have the ability to take actions like that, and we do all the time. Let me give you a simple example. Think about someone who's considering whether to send his 5-year-old son to kindergarten this year. He's wondering, should I redshirt him and send him next year? I'll hold him out a year. Well, if I hold him out a year, he'll be bigger, stronger, more intelligent, more socially skilled, better coordinated. He's going to, and since school is graded on the curve, he's going to do better every year from then on, and he's going to be more likely to get into Cornell or Caltech or Stanford and be successful in life. That sounds like a good deal to me. I put up with him for one more year at home, and I launch him successfully in life. But that's a step any parent can take. And so other parents begin redshirting their kindergartens. So now you have 6-year-old kindergartens, and then 7 and 8 kindergartens. And it's just like the antlers getting bigger. And so what do? We don't leave that decision up to individual parents. The state makes that decision. If your kid turns 6 by December 1st of a given year, he starts kindergarten that fall. That's the rule in Ithaca. Does anybody think that's a stupid rule? If you have special circumstances, you can plead them, but it puts a hurdle in people's paths. It short circuits that conflict between individual and group interest. I think the presumption of the free marketeers is the invisible hand presumption. If the individual wants to do it, it must perforce be in society's interest that it be done. Darwin said, yeah, sometimes individual and social interests coincide. The keen eyesight of the hawk helps the individual, it helps hawks as a group. But not always. The antlers are a counterexample. Oftentimes what helps the individual animal is harmful to the group. And so you just have to make an assessment. Is this particular thing that's in the individual's interest to do good for the group or not? There's no presumption that just because the individual wants to do it, it's good for the group. And if it's harmful to the group, it's quite easy to imagine people who are rational and fully informed agreeing to adopt regulations that tie their hands. One example of which is the kindergarten start date regulation. Auto racing associations limit engine displacement. Are they stupid? No, it's because their engines would just grow bigger and bigger if they didn't do that. And there'd still be only one winner of the race at the end of the day. It's a way to cut down on expenses, if nothing else. Anti-steroid laws. Many libertarians think the athlete should have a right to put steroids in her body if she wants to. If she's willing to take the risk, that's her business. Fine, if that's the only cost of steroids, but there's another cost. If she takes steroids, her time in the 100 meters goes down by 2/100ths of a second. No, it's more than that. It goes down by more than that, by more than the winning margin in any of the last 15 Olympics. And so if you can take those drugs without detection, you have to take them, or else you throw away the huge investment that you've made in preparing for the contest. Are you harming someone when you take those drugs? You bet you are. You're harming someone. Absolutely you are. You're making them either take the drugs and risk the health consequences down the line, or not take the drugs and invalidate the huge investment they've made preparing for the contest. How can you argue that people are not being harmed by the athletes consuming performance-enhancing drugs? It doesn't make sense to argue in those terms. Safety regulation. The libertarians say we shouldn't regulate safety because that prevents rational firms and consumers and workers from making mutually beneficial bargains. And it sounds good. I want to take a riskier job to earn more money. We know riskier jobs pay more. If you don't put a safety device on the saw, you can pay the worker more because you don't incur the cost of the safety device. If the worker is willing to be careful, why shouldn't he be allowed to work with a saw without a blade guard? If they're informed and they sign a waiver, why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? Well, if there were no effects on third parties, I would say, absolutely, that's a conclusive argument. Let them do it. But it's not a conclusive argument because third parties have an interest in this transaction. Why might I want to take a riskier job if I'm a worker? Well, if I'm a worker with a young family, my first goal is to send my kids to a good school. But what's a good school? It's a quintessentially relative concept. It's one that's better than the other schools. How do you get your kid into a good school? This isn't complicated. You got to buy a house in a good school district. Okay, I'll buy one. What's the rub? Houses in good school districts cost more than houses in bad school districts. Go wherever you want. That's true on average. Maybe you can find some wreck of a house in a good school district. You're lucky if that's your main goal. Grab it before someone else grabs it. It won't be on the market for long. But the average person has to pay more if he wants to send his kids to a decent school. If you're the median earner and your goal is to send your kids to a school of average quality, wouldn't we feel suspicious of a parent who wasn't at least that ambitious for his or her kids? Then what that means is that you've got to outbid 50% of all other families to get a house in the average quality school district. So if they sell their safety to get more wages in order to be able to bid for houses in better school districts, and I don't, what happens? Then my kids go to the schools where other students score in the 20th percentile in reading and math, or have metal detectors out front. I'm going to sell my safety too. But then we've all sold our safety. We've all stood to see better. And nobody sees any better than before. All we succeed in doing is bidding up the prices of the houses in the better school districts. So rather than see that happen, we're not stupid or irrational or poorly informed if we sign on to a regulation that limits the extent to which we can put ourselves at risk in the workplace. Why engage in a fruitless, self-canceling arms race to bid up the prices of the houses in the better school districts? That doesn't make any sense from our perspective. But it's not the government telling us we can't do what we want to do, it's us telling us we can't do what we want to do. It's like Tom Schelling's hockey helmet explanation. Why do the hockey players skate without helmets whenever you let them? Because they get an edge from skating without a helmet. They can see better, hear better. If the other team skates without helmets, we skate without helmets too. We're not going to let them get an edge, and then we all skate without helmets. We all get our brains knocked out. Well, rather than see that happen, why not a rule? Why not say everybody has to wear a helmet? And so it's uncontroversial. If a libertarian objected to a rule like that, saying it robs individual hockey players the freedom to decide for themselves whether to wear helmets, what a dumb objection that would be. That's the whole point of the rule. We know that if we have the freedom to decide as individuals how to proceed in that situation, we'll be forced, in effect, to skate without helmets. We don't want to skate without helmets, and so we need a rule. A nudge won't do. You can't put a sign up in the locker room saying, caution, skating without a helmet might lead to serious injury. They know that. So individual interests and group interests don't coincide. That's the main theme. You're not a radical socialist if you believe that. That's just a contingent fact about the world. You haven't become soft-headed if you believe that. You're oblivious to clear evidence if you don't believe that. Here's why there's some good news that arises from that fact. We're a society that desperately needs extra revenue to build transportation systems and repair infrastructure and the like. And we're a society that right now is largely unregulated, where individuals can pursue actions that they see as being clearly in their interest, and that are in their individual interest, but that are contrary to the interests of the broader group. So they're pursuing those actions to excess. There's a win-win move here. By taxing individual behaviors that are attractive individually but unattractive collectively, we can discourage behaviors that are doing more harm than good. We would want to do that whether we needed extra revenue or not. But at the same time, we'll generate extra revenue, which we do need. So where do you go with this? The main policy prescription that I advocate in the book is scrap the income tax altogether and replace it with a much more steeply progressive tax on a family's total annual expenditure, consumption expenditure, progressive consumption tax. You report your income to the IRS, same as you would now. You report how much you saved during the year, like you would for a 401k or a other tax-exempt retirement account. The difference between those two numbers, your income minus your savings, that's how much you spent this year. That amount minus a big standard deduction, let's say $30,000 for a family of 4, that's your taxable consumption. And then the rate you pay on that number, income minus savings minus $30,000, starts off low. Your tax would be as low or lower if you are a low spending unit. But then the more you spend, the more you pay on the next dollar you spend. Let me scare you and propose that if you were spending $5 million a year, it would be perfectly in your interest that the marginal tax rate on the next dollar you spend be 100% or even more. I actually proposed this, and a right-wing blogger made fun of me back when Herman Cain had his 999 plan. He blasted Frank's 100-100-100 plan. Think about it. Right now, the houses have gotten bigger and bigger over the last decades because most of the income gains have gone to the top. People at the top spend more money when they have it. That's what everybody does. So what are we going to do with our money? We're going to build bigger, among other things. What does that do? That just shifts the norm that defines adequate for your circle. Why does a CEO need 30,000 square feet? Because other CEOs have 30,000 square feet. If you didn't, then people think your company wasn't doing very well. So there's a social dimension to consumption. When all the houses get bigger at the top, that doesn't make the CEOs happier. There's no reason to believe that it does, and good reason to believe that it makes them less happy when they all grow bigger, because it's just a pain to manage a bigger property. There are people underfoot. There are tell-all memoirs lurking in the wings. If everybody's mansion were a little smaller, nobody would feel bad about that, and it would be a lot less trouble day to day. So think about a family that's trying to figure out whether to spend $2 million on an addition to its mansion, and now the 100% marginal consumption tax rate confronts this family. What are they going to do? I don't care how rich they are, that's going to send them back to the drawing board. Well, maybe this addition that was going to cost us $2 million now is going to cost us $4 million. Yeah, we can afford it, but let's think about it. The rich spend less on housing when housing prices go up, even though they don't need to spend less in all cases. In New York, the rich live in much smaller housing than the rich do in other cities. Why? Because per square feet, housing is much more expensive in New York, and so that's the norm in New York, is to live in smaller housing. You have housing that feels big, even though it's not as big, absolutely, as in other markets. So the family would say, all right, let's build a $1 million addition pre-tax. We'll pay the tax. That'll bring us back up to what we would have spent anyway. Everyone else makes a similar decision. Here's where the fiscal alchemy in the proposal comes out. So we all build additions half as big, but if beyond some point it's relative addition size that matters, we're all just as happy as we would have been with the bigger additions. In the meantime, the Treasury's got all that tax revenue that it can use to pay down debt and rebuild infrastructure and do other things that would really make a difference in people's lives. This isn't complicated. Here's another thought experiment. Where would the wealthy be happier? Society A, where they drive $200,000 Bentleys on roads that have foot-deep potholes every 10 feet radius. Or Society B, where they drive $150,000 Mercedes sedans on roads that are well maintained. Does anybody doubt that people would be happier in Society B? What would the argument be? I mean, let's just take as given that the Bentley is better than the Mercedes. If it is better, it's not much better. But let it be better. But driving a slightly better car on a much worse road is a way worse experience than driving a good car on a well-maintained road. So we can fix the roads if we're willing to pay more tax. It's not complicated. And if we all paid more tax, it wouldn't be painful to pay more tax. I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague. Did I know all the taxes Obama was planning to levy on us in the coming years? I knew he was planning to let the Bush tax cuts expire. I didn't know about the long list of other taxes. He watches a lot of Fox News. He gets angry about all this stuff. I said, no, I didn't know about it. He seemed shocked I didn't know about this list of taxes. And I told him, you want me to tell you why I don't know about it? He said, yeah. And I told him, I don't follow that because I don't think it makes any difference if he does that. Well, what do you mean? I said, look, is there any chance they're going to reform the tax code in a way that would compromise your ability or mine to buy what we need? No, of course not. He has a successful textbook. I've got a couple of textbooks. We have plenty of money to buy what we need and then some. So what might it do? Might it threaten our ability to buy what we want? Yeah, that was the worry. Well, what do people want beyond some point? They want things that other people like them want that are not in sufficient supply so that everybody can have one. You want a nice view of the lake. You want a slip in the marina. A painting by a certain artist. There aren't enough to go around. And so you have to bid against each other to get them. So if your tax rate goes up and my tax rate goes up, how does it affect our bidding with one another for those things that there aren't enough to go around of? And he didn't want to concede, but I think he felt he needed to think more about his argument. It's a simple argument. Beyond some point, when everybody spends more on broad classes of private goods, there's not that much bang for the buck. And when you shortchange essential elements in the public sector, there are real consequences of that. We could live longer, less stressful, more productive lives, all of us, if we spent our money in different ways. And the simplest way to do that is to steer money in accordance with the best judgments, the best evidence-based judgments on individual and collective interests, where they coincide, where they don't coincide. If I'm pursuing an activity to excess, don't pass a regulation that tells me I can't do it. Tax me for doing it. When I get on a congested roadway, I'm harming everyone who's on that roadway, making them take longer to get where they're trying to get to. Charge me to get on the roadway, and then I'll decide how urgent it is for me to get on the roadway. Maybe I'll decide I'll travel at a different hour. And that will raise revenue. That will speed up the average travel times. There will be a gain on average for everybody. When the pie gets bigger, everyone can get a bigger slice than before. That's a statement I make to all the classes I teach at least 50 times during the semester. If we're engaging in activities that cause more harm than good, and we take steps to discourage those activities, we're making the pie bigger. And what that means is that there's always a way to divide the pie up so everybody gets a bigger slice than before. There's no need for anybody to make any sacrifices here. You don't have to give up any precious freedoms. If somebody says you can't do something that harms others, you shouldn't have had the right to do that in the first place. People object, oh, that's social engineering. I love that one. So, and then you look, well, what is social engineering? It's an attempt to tell the individual that he can't do what he wants to do. Stop signs are social engineering. Homicide laws, they're social engineering. If you're going to regulate people, that's more intrusive than telling them that yeah, you can do this, but it's got to be more expensive. Tax vehicles by weight. Why should I have the ability to buy a 7,000-pound vehicle and put every motorist and pedestrian at greater risk of death and injury without taking anything into account about that risk? Tax vehicles by weight, I'll have to decide whether I need a big vehicle or not. Maybe the smaller station wagon would have been just as good almost, so I'll switch to it. That's the pitch. So I think these are not exactly the issues that are on the table for the campaign, but there's a lot of overlap between the issues that I've brought up here today and the issues that are in the campaign. And again, I tried to give you the bulletproof version of this talk. There are a lot of controversial things out there where you can't get agreement. There really are subjects that people of goodwill can disagree about, and you can understand why they might never, ever really finally be able to resolve their disagreements. I don't think any of the proposals I made fall into that category. So we don't confront any difficult economic choices. That's the takeaway message. I'll take questions if we got time. Yeah, thank you all so much.
Right now, or I don't know,
Nozick.
and you would, I think you would say that, well, we can't harm others, but you're taxing me, and you can't tax me to benefit others. So you can't harm me to benefit. I think is that the same, me not harming others, or others not harming me? Is there a case of it?
If I keep you from getting a benefit, I'm harming you. If I make you so you're unable to get to your destination quickly, I'm harming you. I think this distinction between benefit and harm, there's some psychological dimensions to it. There's a loss aversion literature that we could point to, but from strict economic calculus, most of that is wrong-headed thinking. You want to take $1 worth of lost benefit and say that's worth every bit as much as $1 of additional cost.
Okay, so like free lunches, let's say, or free breakfasts, which are offered at Ed. I'm not doing any harm to you, but you would tax me to make free breakfast. Would that be harm to me?
If I tax you, I'm definitely reducing your options, yes. So that would have to be, if we were going to say, is this a good thing to do? If I take some money from you to pay for those breakfasts, then I am clearly harming you. Then the question is, what's the gain from that? And if the gain outweighs the harm, that means the whole pie is bigger. That means that it would be a mistake not to do it, and then we got to figure out if there's some way to make you whole. And in general, you can make people whole. You don't have to give them a compensation payment for each and everything injury they suffer. You can do transfer payments through the tax system that can. I mean, a lot of people object to using monetary metrics because it's disadvantageous to the poor, but I think that makes the pie smaller, and it would be much better to give the poor more money. Abba Lerner said that in the first economic class I took at Berkeley. The main problem with the poor, he said, is that they don't have enough money. And you should give them more money if you want to do something for the poor. Right.
Has your tax plan attracted any support?
You know, for a long time I got, oh, that's a great idea, but it'll never happen. But this is actually kind of an old idea. Irving Fisher wrote about it in the early 20th century. I wrote an article in 1997 about it. A week later, I got a nice warm letter from Milton Friedman saying he didn't agree that the government should be raising more money now. If this was when the surpluses of the Clinton years were in effect. But he said if the government needed to raise more money, the progressive consumption tax would be the perfect way to do it. And he enclosed a reprint of his article published in the 1943 volume of the American Economic Review, advocating the progressive consumption tax as the best way to pay for the war effort. Now there are two AEI economists with a book out advocating the progressive consumption tax.
I hope you framed Friedman's letter.
I'm sure I didn't throw it out. Can I find it? That's another question.
So I was curious if you
problems as far as like implementing progressive tax at that level and getting the income tax?
There are implementation problems out the wazoo. I mean, you got to figure out what to do with retirees who worked their whole lives and paid income tax. Now you're going to tax their savings? No, you got to grandfather them in. You got to figure out what to do with huge purchases. You buy a house, well, you didn't really spend $1 million this year. You got to figure out some way to smooth that. You got to keep track of borrowing, because borrowing is negative savings. You want to deduct that from savings. Yeah, there's lots to implement, but this has been studied by the tax people. I'm not a tax expert, but there have been big books written about this, and it's doable. Yeah, it's not a forbiddingly complex thing.
Well, first off, thanks for the really interesting talk. I want to ask what might be a sort of a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
So in this progressive consumption tax scheme, let's take your example of people adding expansions to their homes, right? Where normally I would spend $2 million on an expansion, but I'm now taxed at 100%, and so I only spend $1 million, and the other $1 million goes to the government.
Yes, that's the example.
Now, that means that the contractors that I've hired, instead of getting $2 million, only get $1 million.
They get $1 million, right.
And is there potentially an argument there that in the small, that leads to people who are hired as contractors making less money? And in the extreme, it really just encourages tons and tons of savings, and that people won't actually spend anything?
Yeah, good questions. I should have added that we would not want to implement this proposal with the economy in the toilet. It would discourage savings, and I mean, it would discourage consumption and encourage savings. We don't really want to discourage any form of spending right now. So really what we ought to do is pass this into law, but schedule it for implementation on a gradual phase-in only after the unemployment rate's down below, let's say, 6%. That would actually kill two birds with one stone. You know, you would reassure the people who are worried about deficits, with good reason, that there's a revenue stream coming to help deal with that. But what it would also do would be to put people on notice that, hey, this consumption tax is coming. If we were thinking about building an addition onto our mansions, now's the time to do it before they phase this thing in. So you get a massive burst of spending in the short run, which is just what the economy needs. That wouldn't be the particular kind of spending I would advocate. It'd be much better to fix roads and bridges than build bigger mansions. But that's better than nothing. We're not going to get anything the way things are going, so that would be better than nothing. If you think about the effect in the long run, go back to the Y equals C plus I plus G equation. Income equals consumption plus investment plus government spending. If you phase it in gradually, what you'll gradually do is shift money from C to I. So the total doesn't go down. So you've got the same number of people employed as before. It's just they're building more investment goods and fewer consumption goods. There's enough money to buy everything because the income is exactly equal to the amount people get paid for building those goods. And over time, income grows more rapidly. And so consumption, beyond some point, not very distant in the future, would actually be higher than it is would be on the current trajectory. So no, you can have a perfectly vibrant economy with a 65% consumption rate. China has a 50% consumption rate, and they're growing gangbusters. If you want to consume, you want to grow. People say, well, growth's bad for the environment. No, growth is not bad for the environment, actually. It's certain kinds of growth that are bad for the environment. We need to tax CO2. We need to tax all sorts of pollutants and congestion. That's part of the mix too. But growth actually makes people more willing to incur the cost of cleaning up the environment. There's a U-shaped link between environmental cleanliness and output. The more money you have, the more you're willing to spend on those things. Barbara.
Your arguments are speaking to people who have what they need. And Grover Norquist, I think, has been speaking to people who do not have what they need. And hence the traction that the no new taxes movement has gained at the federal level and at the state level. And it bothers, I mean, obviously it must bother a lot of us, but that's the argument that now is out there. No new taxes, and the people in state legislatures and 85% of our current Congress are. No new taxes.
Well, we shouldn't put new taxes on the people in the middle of the income distribution. I mean, those people, because the houses at the top have gotten so much bigger, that's created a cascade that's gone all the way down the ladder. And now the median new house in the US is 2,300 square feet. It used to be 1,500 square feet. Why is it so much bigger? Not because the median earner earns more, because the median earner in wage per hour terms earns less than 30 years ago. It's because people at the top spend more, people just below them who travel in the same circles, they spend more too. You need to have your daughter's wedding reception at home now if you're in that group, and so everybody's cascading down. The proposal is not to raise taxes on the people who've been squeezed by the widening
They're the ones who
income
are voting for the
inequality.
Republicans.
They're making a mistake. Yeah,
We know that. So how do you speak to them?
I think, look, we're in a bind. The campaign finance laws, as modified by the Supreme Court, the Citizens United decision makes it possible for corporate interests to fund unlimited contributions without identifying who they are, and you know they've had growing freedom over the last decades to do that. And what they seem to want, they've been incredibly effective at getting. They want lower tax rates for themselves, and they want lighter regulations for their companies. And they've been getting exactly that for the last 20 years because of the campaign finance system. And the more successful they are at that, the worse the problem becomes, because that makes inequality even greater, so they need to give even more to politicians to get what they want. And so how's that even theoretically a soluble problem? It's a problem that gets more serious year by year. I think the only solution to that problem is to persuade them that they're making a bad bargain for themselves, that what they're buying with their tax cuts is bigger cars and bigger houses and more costly coming-of-age parties for their kids that don't do anything for anybody, but that end up costing them. They got to drive these nice cars on really crappy roads. And accept the fact, you know, the hedge fund guy, his offices are in New York. That's where the dirty bomb's going to go off. That's something I can imagine happening. I can imagine enough people hearing the evidence on this question, say, hey, we screwed up. You know, we voted for the wrong package. This is not the package. But I can't imagine that it's just going to get better on its own, because if they keep demanding lower taxes, they've got the muscle now to get what they want politically.
A lot of your argument is based on the idea of positional goods, and that they're that you're the relative comparison to someone else. So I'm wondering if there's been you or other people who have tried to look at across GNP or whatever other measure you want to measure goods and services in the U.S. about what proportion of our economy is really devoted to the arms race of goods and services.
Yeah, there have been attempts to measure how positional different categories of goods are. If you were really a regulator, what you'd want to do would be to find out how positional every good is and then tax it in an exact proportion to its positionality. I think that's a dumb idea, just because we will never have the information we would need to do that. The steeply progressive consumption tax sidesteps that issue by saying that, well, if you're consuming $5 million a year already, the next dollar you spend is probably on something that's very highly positional. Maybe there's some counterexample to that, but I think if it was something you needed, you would have bought it before you got to $5 million. So, yeah, I mean, regulators need to accept the possibility that their interventions could make matters worse. You know, regulators don't get. It's a struggle to persuade students that you're not done just because you found a market failure. You know, you got to look at the proposed solution to the market failure. That could be even worse than the market failure. Actually, let me read you this. I meant to and I forgot. Here's the OSHA manual. It's not this year's. I think they've taken this out. it's regulations for ladders used in the workplace. What conditions must be satisfied by ladders used in the workplace? The general slope of grain in flat steps of minimum dimension shall not be steeper than 1 in 12, except that for ladders under 10 feet in length, the slope of grain shall not be steeper than 1 in 10. The slope of grain in areas of local deviation shall not be steeper than 1 in 12 or 1 in 10 as specified above. For all ladders, cross grain not steeper than 1 in 10 are permitted in lieu of 1 in 12, provided the size is increased to afford at least 15% greater calculated strength than for ladders built to minimum dimensions. Local deviations of grain associated with otherwise permissible irregularities are permitted. You would read that, and then if you owned the business, you would ask the foreman, do we use any ladders? And you'd say, yeah, get rid of them. You know, we're going to figure out some way to do it without using ladders, rather than try to figure out how on earth you could comply with that. So yeah, you might want to regulate safety, but not that way. Maybe an injury tax would be better. You should be humble as a regulator, but we need to tax something. And my point is that you're not really treading into dangerous territory when there's a behavior that clearly has negative spillovers on others. As long as we're taxing savings, which we're doing now, as long as you're taxing payrolls, why is that a bad thing? Tax these behaviors that have negative spillovers and get your revenue that way. I know I saw a few more.
So would your progressive expenditure tax include the expenditures on services?
Yeah.
So healthcare, education?
Well, you know, you could argue about healthcare. In a decent world, there'd be a single payer healthcare system where that would kind of all be off the books. But yeah, if you had to buy
those for insurance, those would all be.
Yeah, you could have exemptions for all that. You could argue about whether you wanted to have charitable deduction exemptions. You know, all that's fair game. You don't want it to be too complicated, but.
I have more of an evolutionary question. If you talk about relative happiness, wealth, or purchasing in a context of the individual, but you also talk about motless groups, like the wealthy pair with each other. Have you played around with sort of between level or within level processes at all in your modeling?
Well, the big lesson that comes from attempts to study competition in that way, the big lesson is that it's very local. You know, you are not competing against people who are distant from you along any dimension. It's the people who have the same mix of stuff you have that really matter. And so that's why, you know, there's no evidence that the people in the middle get angry when they see yachts and mansions. You know, they like the pictures. They think they're going to be rich someday. Wow. But they're influenced by those things through an indirect chain. The people who are near the people at the top are influenced by the spending at the top, and then there's a group just below them. Look, the average American wedding in 2010, that's the last year I had numbers for, $30,000. In real terms in 1980, it was $11,000. Does anybody really think the people getting married are happier because the number got bigger? No,
They're less happy, so they have to spend more.
It's not something that's really bought anything for people. You know, this CEO spent $10 million on his daughter's coming of age party. He wanted a special occasion, presumably. He got one, but he raised the bar for other families. So now, you know, I was at when I was on sabbatical at NYU a few years ago, I saw a clown going into one of the university faculty housing units. So what's this? Which department has clowns? I'm thinking. No, it's just some chemistry professor's 10-year-olds have your birthday today, and they know that if they don't hire a clown or a magician, the kid will be disappointed in them. You know, we didn't have clowns or magicians, and we weren't disappointed. It's the standards have shifted. You know, what you have to give your best friend's daughter when she gets married now is way more expensive than before. or it won't be an appropriate gift.
Towards the end of your discussion, you mentioned about banning something versus
Yeah.
pricing it. Do you think is there some kind of a difference at some level? You decide that certain things have to be banned, like prostitution, heroin. Can we price them in a market and say, okay, this much is allowed?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think my claim that's better to tax than ban really is focused on behaviors whose consequences could be reasonably described as small bore. Things that you wouldn't be willing to spend a very significant fraction of your lifetime income one way or another, either to have or avoid. There are some things that I think we just want to take off the table, but I don't want to get into.
Because I've seen some people make that argument.
There are arguments pro and con on organ sales. There's a positional argument to make against organ sales. Do you want your kids to feel they have to sell a kidney in order to be able to keep up with the bidding for houses in good school districts? Well, let me see if I can find somebody who hadn't had a chance yet.
I like the idea of sort of taxing individual behavior and spillovers to benefit society. I was wondering, is there a way to implement it to in areas or the Congress? Because I feel like even if you get your plan as you want it completed through the Congress, all these congressmen with their individual lobbyists lining their pockets, they would just turn that into a new class of tax loopholes.
Yeah, it's a good point. You got to fight to keep the thing as clean as you can make it be, and it's going to come through a democratic process that's never produced a clean thing yet. So maybe it's not realistic to hope that they'll produce a clean bill. But we do periodically go through and clean up the tax code. So maybe you accept that it's not going to be perfect, and you try to clean it up as often as you can. Chuck.
I have a question regarding your optimism about Darwin as the replacement for Smith. And just using the case that you emphasize in the book and you brought up in your talk about bull elks. I may be judging the book by its cover unfairly here, but I want to know if the case that you put so much weight on and others that you surely have looked at in terms of this arms race and the contradiction between individual reproductive fitness and population or species fitness. Are these examples exceptions across species and populations? And if there are biologists in the room, and evolutionary biologists, please help me out with the question. But I'm worrying that if you your larger argument, I buy entirely. To the extent that Darwin is going to be the patron saint of it, I worry that you may have put a lot of stock in exceptional cases rather than cases where there isn't the contradiction between the individual and a collective action aggregate scenario.
The conflicts between individual and group interest are not exceptional at all. They're rife in nature and in human society. The fact is, it's relative performance that governs whether you get your stuff into the next round, and so on almost every dimension, there's pressure to enhance your performance relative to those you're competing against, and when each stands taller, no one gets an edge, and the expense of standing taller. Sometimes there are positive externalities from the attempt to stand taller, so that you can't say that in every case there's a conflict. And I did mention the example of keen eyesight and hawks. There was no conflict there. I used to use intelligence as an example. Good for the individual, it's good for the group too. I then read about an example of a Connecticut police department recruiting ad that said they didn't want anyone with an IQ over some threshold. They had discovered if you were too smart, you weren't very good as a cop. It would seem like an odd thing. So you can imagine circumstances where even that one might be an individual group conflict. No, but they're widespread. David Sloan Wilson has written a lot about multi-level selection theory, and it's his view that it's the general rule that the selection at the individual level favors nastiness, and selection at the next level up favors nicer behavior. That's not always true, I don't believe, but.
So I guess I'm just sort of curious because you seem to be conflicting a tiny bit with Eleanor Ostrom and, sort of her late life work, which goes into the behavioral experiments that show people are much more generous than they're expected to be by self-interest alone. And also, she literally said that too much top-down can interfere with some of the natural socially mediated cooperation, like through indirect reciprocity and things like that.
Great question. I'm a big fan of her body of work. I think she was absolutely terrific as an insightful analyst of those kinds of situations. And she's writing about situations where there's conflict between individual and group interest, and her focus was on situations where people were able to organize informally to resolve the conflicts. And that's great when it's possible to do that. Sometimes transaction costs make it impossible to do that. Think about the global warming problem. There's just no way to imagine all the emitters in the world coming together and negotiating agreements to reduce emissions without some central body able to impose a tax on emissions or a cap on emissions from the top down. Suppose you say, I hate the color purple. I want a law that says no one can paint his house purple.
You can do that in California.
Maybe some jurisdictions will allow that, but basically we say, well, tough, just get used to it. But we would allow a private homeowners association to say, if you want to paint your house, it's got to come from this book of colors. And there's nothing incoherent about that. If you don't like that book of colors, go to a different homeowners association. It's better to solve the problem that way than to say everybody has to choose from a narrow book of colors. But sometimes not practical to do it from the bottom up. Yeah, the main thing that would please me would be if people would just recognize that this problem exists and then look for practical ways to solve it. And if you can do it without the government being involved at all in it, good. That's good. Yeah, fine.
The last time Darwin had a large impact on social policy, at least economics and social science, was probably late 19th century. It was called social Darwinism. What would make you optimistic that your version of Darwin rather than that version of Darwin would be ascendant at this point?
Well, that wasn't Darwin's movement. That was a kind of a brutal misreading of Darwin. It was a portrayal of his scheme as saying whatever evolved was good, and that if it didn't evolve on its own, it wasn't good. That's denying the conflict between lower level interest and upper level interest. Darwin was, by all accounts, an incredibly humane person. He wasn't in favor of the nastiness of that approach. No, I don't think there's any need to defend Darwin's framework against. That was an unfortunate episode that his ideas were hijacked by a group and used in that way. But I think his insights are appropriate to think about the conflict between interests at different levels.
If there's one more question, put it up. Otherwise, I think we should close up and give Bob an applause. October 5th is the next in this multidisciplinary series. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice.
Yeah.